Welcome everybody. Welcome you all to this important roundtable conference on Russia-Ukraine crisis and the geopolitical fallout. We understand the situation is very sensitive right now. The hostilities are on in the real time as we speak. So it is very important to understand this whole situation from a clear perspective. So I thank you all for joining us today. And without wasting much time, I would like to welcome our CEO and founder, Mr. Abhinav Pandya, to brief the meeting.
Thank you very much, Akshay. And first and foremost, I would like to welcome all our eminent speakers and the participants today could spare time and join this very critical and important discussion. Okay? So I don't have much to say because I don't want to waste much of the time before we begin the program. But then, yes, no one imagined that the things would escalate to this level. But the certain things have been escalated in Europe, and it certainly doesn't bring very good message, for in general for the humanity and the global peace. But then from here, we ask several questions. The reason why we have titled the event as the Ukraine-Russia war and its geopolitical fallouts, because it very strongly appears that this is not going to have an impact confined to Europe only. This will have its likely impact on the various other parts of the world. It will have its impact on the Middle East, where the nations have been doing tightrope balancing between the US and between the Western world, mostly US and Washington, especially after 2015 when the Moscow intervened in Syria and played a very critical role in dismantling ISIS. This is also going to have a major impact on how China behaves with Taiwan and also with the Indian neighbor, especially in the Tibet region. This is also going to have a major impact on India's reactions and India's behavior in the geopolitical scenario also, because as we have seen that Russia is India's historical ally, but then India has also developed a very strong and critical strategic partnership with Americans over the last 20 years, despite the fact that there is a strain of uneasiness and lack of trust which prevails between the US and India. And also India strongly depends on Russia for the weapons industry and for armaments. So this is something which is going to have a very strong impact on the geopolitical patterns across the world. Apart from that, it will also have an impact on the global norms and standards which we are following, as the idea of nationalism and again the clashes over religious extremism is back. The Cold War II is back. So today we have speakers from various parts of the world, and what I request and what I hope to listen today is that what are their perspectives how do they look at this development which has taken place in Europe and how it's going to have likely impacts on the future scenario. Thank you so much, and I guess, Akshay, I think we can invite our moderator today, Professor Tatiana, to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So I would like to welcome our moderator for this session, Dr. Tatiana Belsuwa. So Dr. Belsuwa is an assistant professor at the General School of International Affairs, and she received her PhD at the University of Kerala Department of Political Science. Her PhD research was sponsored by Indian Council of Cultural Relations. Prior to this, Dr. Belsuwa completed her postgraduate study at the St. Petersburg State University, Russia, Department of World Economy. In 2012, Dr. Belsuwa was participating in research project at the Monash University, Melbourne, studying the Indian diaspora in Australia. She also participated in several capacity building programs, including the one in New Delhi and Hamburg. Her research interests are related to evolution of the post-Soviet space and Russian foreign policy. And she is a regular contributor to several well-known newspaper as well. So I thank you, Professor, for joining us today. You have been very generous to accept our invitation on such a short notice. And I would like to tell our audience that she is my professor who taught me about Russia and its foreign policy, even taught me the Russian language. So I thank you and welcome, Professor, and you may take over the session now.
Thank you very much, Akshay. Thank you for your generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So greetings, everyone. Welcome to our today's roundtable discussion or conference on the topic Ukraine-Russia war and its geopolitical implications. The theme cannot be more relevant under the current circumstances, as we all have been witnessing the horrific events unfolding in Ukraine. The crisis arguably started back in 2014, when the Russian government made the decision to annex the Crimean Peninsula. Since then, the tensions between Russia and NATO allies have never really subsided. Shortly after the annexation, the civil war in Donbass broke out between the Ukrainian government and Russia-backed separatists. The Minsk agreements of 2015 that were expected to bring ceasefire and reconciliation between two parties had not brought the desired outcomes. Since then, Russia had been many times accused of military buildups near the border with Ukraine, but the country denied the allegations, saying that those were just military exercises. The latest escalations happened, as we all know, in the beginning of this year, when Russia amassed its troops encircling Ukraine from the north, south, and east. This caused the countermeasures from the NATO members as they started sending financial and military support to Ukraine. There were lots of speculations as to what was going to happen next. Amidst the fears of possible Russia's invasion in Ukraine, plenty of diplomatic efforts were made to resolve the crisis. Russian government made clear demands and expected their fulfillment. This included, among others, written guarantees that Ukraine would never become a NATO member, as well as removal of the military presence from the countries like Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, who had joined NATO in the recent decades. The main Russia's argument was its national security concerns. The US and European Union, in their turn, considered those demands unrealistic and were not ready to give Russia any concessions. Meanwhile, on February 22nd, Russia unilaterally recognized independence of two people's republics, namely Donetsk and Lugansk. That itself sent the shockwaves across the world, as many thought that Russia had increased its influence in the eastern Ukraine even further. On February 24th, the worst case scenario and fears had been materialized, as Russian president declared a quote-unquote military operation in Ukraine, which can basically be considered as a kind of euphemism for a full-scale war in the neighboring country. Now, we have all been watching in horror how this invasion has been unfolding and when and how it should be stopped. Now, let me introduce our distinguished guest today. We are happy to have with us Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu. He is a policy analyst at Development Reimagine. He specializes in geopolitics with particular reference to Africa in a changing global order. His work focuses on research and providing clear geopolitical and strategic advice to address conflicts, geoeconomics, and international power politics, with special attention to questions of territory, security, statehood, and sovereignty in the pursuit of development. He is a policy analyst at Development Reimagined and a geopolitical analyst at Afropolitica. Mr. Ovigwe is frequently quoted in international media and has appeared on such media outlets as Al Jazeera, TRT World, CGTN, DW News, BBC Radio, and many others. Also with us today, Dr. Katja Banik. Dr. Banik is a managing editor at PwC China Compass. She is an author, speaker on current geopolitical, economic, and political issues related to China, European Union, and the US, focusing on Jacques Ansel's geopolitical vision, identity of heart, and global governance. She's also, She's also the author at Modern Diplomacy and World Scientific and book author of editions Le Harmattan Paris. Also, I am happy to introduce Mr. Karsten Riise. Mr. Riise is partner and editor at Change News and Change Management. Karsten Riise is a Master of Science from Copenhagen Business School and has a university degree in Spanish culture and languages from Copenhagen University. He's the former Senior Vice President, Chief Financial Officer of Mercedes-Benz in Denmark and Sweden. He writes regularly for the Russian International Affairs Council. Also, I'm glad to introduce to you Mr. Mohammed Ali Bek. Mr. Bek is working as a research associate at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, Pakistan. He co-authored the book Realism and Exceptionalism in US Foreign Policy from Kissinger to Kerry, which was published in 2020. He also writes for The Nation, Daily Times, Pakistan Observer, Pakistan Today, and Hilal magazine. His research areas include South Asia, Asia Pacific, and India conventional warfare. Also, let me introduce to you our next guest, who is Mr. Ararat Kostanian. Mr. Kostanian is an expert on the Middle Eastern studies and international relations. He has worked as an expert at the Turkish Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Armenia, and currently works as a junior fellow and a PhD candidate at the Institute of Oriental Studies, National Academy of Science of Armenia. He writes analytical articles for top media portals, academic centers, and newspapers in Armenia, Lebanon, Malaysia, India, and Canada. He is active on the top TV channel programs and joins at live TV sessions as a commentator in top channels in Armenia, Lebanon, UAE, and Russia. And also, I would like to introduce to you, no need of introduction, actually, Mr. Abhinav Pandya. Mr. Pandya is the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Usanas Foundation. He's a Cornell University graduate in public affairs. He is a policy analyst specializing in counterterrorism and Indian foreign policy. He writes for the National Interest USA, Vivekananda Foundation think tanks, Haaretz Israel, The Economic Times India, Sandy Guide. He has authored the book, which is called Radicalization in India and Exploration, which was published in the year 2019. So shall we start? And Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu, please, the floor is yours. Please share your insights on the topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I want to express my sincere appreciation for the opportunity to be here, to speak with you all and to discuss with, this very crucial issue with such an eminent, personalities. And when I saw the email, I couldn't be more excited, to prepare for this day and be in this space. So once again, thank you all very much. And yeah, just like I said, I was introduced. My name is Ovigwe Eguegu. I'm from Nigeria. I'm currently in Abuja. And I would say when we started this, when the issue started sometime last year, in terms of you started hearing that rhetoric from Western media about possible Russia incursion into Ukraine, very few people who I work very closely with here in the country, senior officials, they started asking some of us, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is not going to happen? And all of that. So those were, some of the thinking that was going on here, even in the continent of Nigeria and some other African countries that I also am very involved in. And to see what has happened today, it's very much in line with some of the, some of the thoughts. But again, one of the things I always mention in those meetings is that we cannot understand today's events without at least going back, to 2008. And when I speak of 2008, I'm talking about the NATO summit of April 2008 in Bucharest, Romania. And in that particular summit, if you have some of you probably have seen the readout, it was very clear, that Georgia and Ukraine will be accepted, into NATO. And when you see the response coming from many African countries, Kenya, for instance, South Africa, Nigeria, there's a lack of awareness of what has been going on in the lead up to to today. So a lot of people think maybe one morning somebody in Moscow woke up and said, you know what, let's go into Ukraine and just repeat 2014. So most of the time, the analysis that I even saw in terms of that informed some of the public speaking that you've seen starts from 2014. I said, no, you can't start from 2014. We have to go back to at least 2008. And even before 2008, we also have to look at 1999, when Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic joined NATO, and then there was another wave again in 2004, Estonia, Romania, Latvia, and some of the Baltic states. So this is something that I would say has been missing. This history is missing from the analysis that has informed responses coming from some particular countries on the continent. And when the conversation starts around, okay, so what exactly is happening, I said, you look at the root causes. The root causes, one is that NATO eastward expansion, which is very popular, but it's not contextualized enough. And then secondly, it's the 2014 Orange Revolution, if in Ukraine, which especially which was specifically rather to create a regime that is not only compliant to Washington's vision for Europe, but also specifically to act as a cat's paw against Western cat's paw, NATO's cat's paw against Russia. And then someone asked that question when I was giving that analysis and said, okay, so but you cannot take away the fact that the West wants its own security guarantees as well. I said, okay, then you have to explain to me which country has Russia taken into its own CSTO. If you have Mexico in CSTO, or you have Canada in the CSTO, that is when you can start talking about equivalence of the issue. It's not an equivalent situation at all. So, when I was preparing for this event today, one of the things I wanted to point out very clearly is that in many cases on the continent, I'm talking of very senior officials, people in foreign ministries, people in what or equivalent to what you call State Department if in US, they lack the awareness of this thing. So if we move away from those the root causes, like I said, the NATO expansion and then also the regime change that creates very hostile regime, then let's look at the proximate causes. The US advisors and NATO advisors going to Ukraine, arming up the massive buildup of weapons in Ukraine before this 2014. So before 2022 incident. So these are some of the main issues that are missing from the analysis coming from the content. But very specifically now, I would like to go into two reasons why I feel we've seen the statements coming from. So generally in the continent, there's been silence, right? And this silence means in the sense that we have 55 African economies. The very vocal has been Kenya, for instance, one country. And then we saw silent. When I mean silent, the Nigerian foreign minister was actually asked about his response 3 days ago. And he actually just chuckled and walked and smiled and walked away from the reporter, giving no answer. But up until we saw the racial profiling happening in the border between Ukraine and Poland, that was when the Nigerian government gave an official response, which I would say was because of that incident, because there was the attitude in Abuja here was just to act as if nothing was happening, because it's a very complicated issue and you really don't want to get into very quick and hasty conclusions like we saw with Kenya. So that situation from my perspective was mainly to give to address the issue happening in the Ukrainian border. But you cannot address that issue happening in the Ukrainian border without talking about the broader issue that's causing that people to flee in the first place. Now, if we go to if you look at Kenya, for instance, Kenya has had a very funny, or we will say very phony, foreign policy in the continent, because one of the major issues for African countries really trying to create a more, I would say, a more vocal or a more impactful change is that we find out that Kenya tends to be more compliant, to Western construction for the continent. For instance, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was supposed to create one market, and then all of a sudden we started seeing Kenya negotiating with the US for its own free trade agreement, which is contrary to what exactly the continent is trying to work towards. And then we saw the same thing again with the EU EPAs trying to make those side agreements that really goes against the continental, where the continent is heading towards. And that takes me to the AU. The AU statement was the AU statements, which President Macky Sall of Senegal, who is the current AU chairperson, his 1 year term actually just began, and then the Moussa Faki of Chad. So they released this. When the AU statement was actually taken out of context, a lot of reports. So when the statement came out, there was a line there, and I quote, the Africa Union expression of extreme concern at the very serious and dangerous situation created, in Ukraine. Now, it did not say invasion. It did not actually come out clearly to condemn the act, but a lot of news media actually did report that statement as condemnation. Particularly, one of the most prominent news media, the biggest news media that quoted that statement out of context was the Daily Kenya. And I actually remember tweeting, and myself and some other analysts on the continent tweeting that there's nowhere in that AU statement, official statement, where the word invasion was used or condemnation, was used. So you see that very, that eagerness, from Kenya, which was very obvious from the speech from, his from the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations. And one of the things I actually want to point out is that speech is actually more popular outside of the continent than in the continent. You could see that the hysteria that followed that speech was coming from, from Europe, was coming from the United States. Even the ambassador's PhD supervisor actually went on Twitter, to which I think it was in LSE, I think, or King's College London, actually went on Twitter to say, I'm very proud of my my former PhD student, the ambassador of Kenya to the United Nations. We didn't see that kind of support coming from internally in the continent as opposed to to outside of the continent. Now, a very peculiar case is South Africa. Now, South Africa is another case study in terms of Africa's response and perceptions to this situation in Ukraine, because first of all, we saw silence from South Africa, and then there was pressure from DECO. So DECO is like Directorate of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, which is like equivalent of the foreign ministry. And we saw a lot of analysts, not necessarily the most popular in South Africa, but a lot of pressure coming from some think tanks, some quarters in South Africa to actually put out a statement. And then Naledi Pandya, who is the foreign minister, gave out a statement, and she, talked about Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity being respected, and Russia to pull out its troops. But not long after that, the president of South Africa did not come out to sort of walk back from that statement. So the Sunday Times actually reported, that President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, would not characterize the statement coming from the foreign ministry as the position of so you can see it's not necessarily the position of South Africa. And why we're seeing that is because South Africa is a very unique example in African countries in terms of Russia relations because of BRICS. South Africa is a member of the BRICS grouping, so it's quite was quite surprising to see that very, I would say, strong statement coming from, from South Africa. So to wrap up, I would say if you look at the continent of Africa in terms of response to the crisis in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine rather, it really comes down to two things. So one, there's a lack of coherent, foreign policy. And South Africa is a good example of that, where the foreign minister is saying one thing, and then the president coming out to say another thing. So it shows you have countries where they don't really have like, synergistic or very coherent policy or foreign policy between, what the executive branch and or the ministers, rather, the cabinet members. So they don't really know how to respond. And I was telling someone at the South African Institute of International Affairs, a very reputable think tank, that African countries had time to plan their response for this situation. This is something that has been brewing. It didn't happen overnight. So to see the country like South Africa, that is supposed to be more put together in terms of the foreign policy and has a very strong relationship with Russia and China and Brazil and all of these countries trying to transform global structure. To see South Africa not put out a very consistent message just goes to show that there's lack of cohesion and proper foreign policy. And then secondly, I ascribe this to what I call a weak state mentality. So weak state mentality, a good example would be Kenya, in the sense that because we have weak states in the continent, there is a tendency for African countries to be champions of territorial integrity and sovereignty, because they know that if you have a global system that where the big powers do not quote unquote respect international law, then the weak powers they become breakfast. So it's is this concern that we need the big guns to play by the rules, or else we are doomed. And that in a way is you can use that to explain Kenya, Nigeria's position. Not Nigeria, sorry. The position of Kenya for this situation. But I will say to a large extent, it's not that. It's that and more being that historic compliance and deviation from a more African one African voice on this issue. So if I would for final statement, I would say the AU, the African Union statements regarding the crisis and the conflict in Ukraine seem to be the most popular in the continent. And I'm saying that because whenever you see a statement come out from the AU that countries do not agree with, they tend to speak up a little bit, or also to sort of like put out a counter statement that would differentiate the country from the broader continental readout. And that is exactly what I think is the more popular position, and really explains the so-called ties to that so-called weak state mentality. So that's my take, and that's my perception and my understanding of the continent's response and the individual countries that have been very vocal, or responding to a deafening silence. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing other speakers put out more insightful and informative analysis to the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu. Thank you for your insights, for sharing your perspectives. You are right in terms of coherence, but it is lack of coherence rather. But I think it is under the circumstances when everybody basically was caught by surprise. It is very difficult to present, so to say, carefully crafted responses. And that goes to many countries across the world. So it can be viewed as a particularly challenging task under the circumstances. You mentioned, I think in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations. And I remember recently I was watching an interview with him on CNN. So he was invited for the interview to CNN, and he was mostly he was viewed and treated as a hero for the kind of remarks he had shared during the recent UN Security Council meeting. So, yes, thank you so much once again. And I would like to invite Dr. Katja Banik for sharing her insights and perspectives. Thank you.
Professor, sorry to cut you
That's
off.
fine. Okay. Are you stopping the recording now or not?
Professor Banik, back to you on. Yeah, we'll come back to you on that. We may skip.
Akshay, what we can do is that you can pause the recording now and you can resume the recording after Dr. Katja ends the speech.
I just give you some.
Now we have what we have, and yeah, you brought about a very relevant question, but which sounds rather rhetorical at the moment. Why the governments of Germany and Russia, for example, when they had a chance, even being able to communicate shared languages, shared mother tongues, why they have failed to engage more in cooperation and to prevent what we are having at the moment. So thank you, Dr. Banik. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
So we will proceed with Mr. Karsten Riise. Please, the floor is yours, sir. Share your thoughts
thank
with
you.
us.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Abhinav Pandya and Usanas Foundation, and to you, Tatiana, for hosting this event and for having this opportunity to draw some geopolitical lines. And I would like to start with the line which Eguegu mentioned, that this is actually something which has been a long time coming, and it is not just a surprise which happened here on the 24th of February. There is a long history, and as Katja Banik mentions, a history of missed opportunities to work together with Russia and not just see Russia as an enemy image. And I will not go into all the details of this long history, because it is actually going back into you can start at any point. You can start in 2008 as Ovigwe does. You can start in 2014 in the Maidan. You can take in between the war in Georgia, where the US supported a coup, a color revolution against Shevardnadze, who was legally elected president, and the Americans installed a friend who was an awful monster, the Saakashvili, who's now wanted for corruption in his own country. And he was hailed as a big hero in the US media as anti-corruption, and instead he was one of the biggest corruptors, even also later in Ukraine when the Georgians didn't want him. And protected officially in the USA by Joe Biden and the US administration. Or we could go back to the 1990s with the war in ex-Yugoslavia, where everything that Russia wanted to say or do or had as kind of word or interest was totally trampled upon in that occasion. I will here in my presentation, for the sake of clarity, have a look at what happened in Ukraine in 2014, when a democratically and legally elected leader of Ukraine was toppled by something which in 2014 in Kiev was very similar to the riots in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January last year, when a lot of right-wing people came and tried to seize power. In the USA, they didn't succeed. In Ukraine they did. And there is a lot of silencing in US and Western media about Nazis and extreme right-wing people in Ukraine. But I can assure everybody listening here that this is a very big concern of the Russians, and I think it should be a very big concern for all of us in the world. If you look at this image here, this is Ole Chanyubok, who was at that time leader of Svoboda, one of the right-wing parties. I cannot say inside his brain, I cannot see inside his head, but he looks, I'm sorry to say, he looks very much like a Nazi. And what he says and does looks very much like Nazism. His party, Svoboda, was officially sending a representative in terms of solidarity, in quotation mark, for John Demjanjuk, one of the infamous SS guards at the concentration destruction camps in Sobibor in Russia during World War II. Johnson Demjanjuk, who is now no longer living, was one of the guards there and was convicted for the death of 28,000 Jews in Sobibor. And he is a Ukrainian hero in the views of people like Ole Chanyubok and other who are now having in their party a lot of power in Ukraine. And I would also say that there is here a very strong US connection of support to all this show here of Nazi or Nazi-like. I cannot say if they are Nazi, but they are very much like Nazis in this. Here you have Chanyubok again, and you have here the mastermind, Joe Biden's right hand, Victoria Nuland, who was masterminding the whole coup in Maidan in 2014 and throwing out a leader, elected president of Ukraine, who was unfortunately for himself, pro-Russian. And she organized, there was a telephone conversation with her, how she organized and pulled all the strings in Ukraine. It was leaked and came into the press, how she organized what positions should be given to whom. Here you have, behind her, you have Vitaly Klitschko. He was called Klitsch in her telephone conversation. And Klitsch, as he called him, is still today the mayor of Kiev. So he was firmly put into power. And she also put into power Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who became the first non-elected leader in Ukraine after the coup in 2014. I'll see if I can hear. Here you have another American connection. This is at that time, Senator McCain, who was a very famous US senator. Again, you have here the leader of Svoboda at that time, the Nazi or Nazi-like force in Ukraine, and they are very powerful also today. We saw before Vitaly Klitschko, who may be from another party, but he was part of the whole setup from 2014. And we see how this Svoboda and these right-wing people, extreme right-wing, I should say, not just moderate right-wing, but extreme right-wing. They also got the defense minister of Ukraine. It is not an inconsequential post. They got one of the three prime minister posts. They got the prosecutor general, so they could prosecute everybody who was speaking Russian. And they didn't want to do anything else but suppress the Russian language in Russia. And they got police leaders too. And this party, Svoboda, in Ukraine is not the only far-right or Nazi or neo-Nazi-like party. In Ukraine, we also have the so-called right sector. This is how they're called, Pravi sector. And one of their leaders at that time said in a BBC video that National Socialist ideas or Nazi ideas are popular here in Ukraine. We want a clean nation, not like Hitler, but a little bit like that. So they want something like Hitler, and this is their own words. So no wonder anti-Russian, many of them anti-Jewish, not all of them, because I know some of the people in Ukraine are also Jewish, but these people are definitely very racially minded and want a clean nation. And I understand very much, because Ukraine has never been what they would see as a clean nation. Ukraine is a crossroad between East and West, and there has always been influences from the western part of Western Europe and from Russia. And if they want to have a peaceful country, which I hope they will have before too long, they need to have not a clean nation, but a diverse nation. But this is not what the Americans want, and they support these forces. I would like to remind those who would say it can't be that the Americans are supporting right-wing and Nazi forces in Ukraine, but the US is using any kind of extremist power they can to topple forces in other countries. The USA created Osama bin Laden against Russia. They later destructed him, like they did with many of their own creations. The US created Al-Qaeda, which was Osama bin Laden's organization. They created the Taliban also against Russia. They protected ISIS oil exports for 4 years. ISIS in Syria was exporting long tanker convoys into Turkey. And the Americans did nothing. And when the Russians, thankfully, I would say the Russians came into Syria, and it's not like I think that Assad was a very nice president in Syria, but ISIS was even worse. And it took Russia only, I think, 2 or maybe a little more than 2 weeks. They had bombed away all ISIS oil exports, tanker convoys. The Americans didn't do it. They protected the ISIS oil exports and their money. From Kishore Abubani in Singapore, he once mentioned that as a source that the USA also transported ISIS fighters into Syria. And the USA does with Al-Qaeda what they probably also are doing with these neo-Nazis in Ukraine. These people don't change their mind. They are still neo-Nazis, but the Americans suddenly say they have become moderate. And the Americans did the same with Al-Qaeda. They just renamed them in Syria and called them Al-Nusra, and suddenly they were moderate Islamists and not extremist middle Islamists. And the US transported Islamist jihadists into the Yugoslavia war too, to make it all worse and split Yugoslavia. And this is something which I have from a personal source who was very close to the events of that time. So it's not, when you know this, which is not general knowledge in the West, then you are no longer so surprised that the Americans could support and do support neo-Nazis fighting especially in Donbass in Ukraine against Russian speakers. And I would like to remind also that these forces, these Islamic forces here, caused a war in Chechnya inside Russia, which killed 60,000 Russian. And I would suspect that there might also be there a US connection. And as Eguegu said, where will this stop with NATO expanding against Russia? We had in 1999 Poland coming into NATO against promises which have been documented through a letter which was uncovered by the Spiegel, Der Spiegel magazine in Germany, how it had been recorded for the posterity that USA had promised not to expand NATO into former Soviet territory. Very sensitively, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which is a very problematic NATO partners, because they are only a little more than 100 or 200 kilometers from the center of St. Petersburg, very, very sensitive area. Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria. Then we have some smaller countries coming, and then of course here the 2008 Bucharest agreement in NATO to let in Ukraine and Georgia somewhere probably in the 2020s. And I do understand these are former Soviet republics, and as Eguegu said, it would be like making a Chinese military base on the border to the United States in Canada as well as in Mexico. I do understand that Russia is now saying this cannot and will not ever be, and the West didn't listen to the problems that security problems that Russia has with this, but this is a fact. And the next here in red is, of course, a conjecture. I cannot prove what would have happened in the future if this had been allowed by Russia to continue. But I don't think that NATO and the USA would have stopped in Ukraine and Georgia, putting them into the Western world. I think they would have continued into Russia itself, Russia proper, with new wars in Dagestan and Chechnya, which could easily be restarted from Georgia. And if Nazis are working in Ukraine, they could also work in Moscow. That would be the next phase if the Russians had not put down their foot down. It could easily be that Russia would be a Yugoslavia War 2.0, much bigger and much more bloody. So maybe this is not a choice of a war from Russia, but it is a choice between one war outside Russia and a smaller one. I dare say, I know it is not a smaller one in the sense that what we see in Ukraine is of course awful, but what could have come instead would be much, much, much worse. I would like to finish off here about what are the consequences, how is this all going? And what we see is that the Russians are concentrating forces in Kiev and also a bit in Kharkov. And it is very clear that Russians want to make a solution in the city of Kiev. We hear a lot about in Western media that Ukraine is slowing down the Russian advance and a lot of things which I would call, excuse me for my language, Tatiana, but which I would call bullshit. We see no reports, and here I would say lack of evidence is actually here an evidence. We see no Western reports about the Ukraine army putting up a fight and stopping anybody from Russia entering now. The Russians could have cut off the western border of Ukraine, and I think the reason why Russia hasn't done it is that they are allowing refugees, people who want to leave Ukraine, not because all their homes have been destroyed, but they just want to leave. And the Russians are allowing that. As for the war, I would say that the Russians so far, of course, every time one apartment building goes down, there is a big news in CNN and New York Times about it, but considering how big the country is and how big the military operation is, I would say that the Russians are actually taking very much care to protect the Ukrainians. The Russians seem to know that they have to live with Ukraine forever and be friends again, and it seems to me that the Russians are taking very, very big care for the civilians of Ukraine, and I think this is something we should recognize. Nothing is perfect in war. War is bloody and war is always ugly, but the Russians seem to be doing everything they can. The next thing we will have, this is a map of the main streets, main roads into Kiev. And the next thing we see now, this morning, we see a column of 60 kilometers of Russian military, which is now entering Kiev. And they have many main roads to enter Kiev. And I think the Russians have a very good chance to divide Kiev into various sectors and deal with that. The Russians have also been very careful not to, they could have disconnected electricity, they could have been disconnecting water, the Russians could have been disconnecting telephones. The Russians have done none of that, which again shows actually to the world that the Russians are taking care not to create unnecessary pain for the civilian population. But of course, Russians also have to achieve their objectives. we see very little evidence about Ukrainians actually destroying anything from the Russian military. Here is a truck from Donbass. This morning there was an image on the New York Times about one truck, a similar truck, on the road into Kiev. But we see actually that Ukrainians are doing very little opposition against the entering Russian forces. This means that Russia is winning the war militarily, and the USA and the NATO will not mess militarily now with Russia. So there's only one thing which can be looked upon here for the future, and that is the economic aspect. And I say sanctions. What sanctions? The Americans and the West Europeans are doing everything they can, but they cannot escape the fact that Russia supplies nearly 17% of all gas in the world, number 2 in the world, and 41% of EU's gas and about 10% of EU total energy comes from Russia. More than 50% of Germany's gas comes from Russia. I mean, if the West wants to cut down that as sanctions against Russia, they are hitting themselves harder than they hit the Russians. And now there's a lot of talk about disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, from payment system. But I mean, the logic is if they can't pay the Russians the money for their gas, they won't have any gas, and Russia will shut down gas to Germany, and German industry will stop tomorrow. So I know there's a lot of talk, and it seems like Biden is absolutely desperate about this, but there's no way that they can totally disconnect Russia. Russia also supplies 12% of the petrol in the world. So even without that, I mean, if they reduce the export from Russia of petrol, then the price of petrol will go from already $100 per barrel to $150 or even $200, and Russia will export less but actually earn more. So I don't really see how they cannot bring Russia to the knees here in economic terms. And as Katja Banik has mentioned, they have estranged Russia here now for more than 2 decades. And Russia has got everything that Russia needs through Asia and through China. So there is no need for that. Which brings me to my final chart, which is a point of this discussion here today. What are some of the regional consequences? We see a very strange map politically of Europe. The blue countries are NATO countries, and we see here Belarus and Ukraine will be in the Russian sphere. There's no doubt about that. Probably Moldova too. There will be a discussion about the Baltic countries. I have provocatively painted them in a shade of blue and red, because I do believe that if NATO should want to put offensive weapons, especially you have the region here in Estonia close to St. Petersburg, I think that could provoke a Russian response, a military response, and it would mean simply that NATO would fall apart into pieces. Here we have the Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Finland, and they are officially neutral, but in reality, they are both of them already member of NATO, full integrated in the NATO command system and everything. So they are actually de facto NATO members, but we have also Turkey, which is actually the opposite. Actually, Turkey is a NATO member, but in reality, Turkey is a neutral country. And this is the funny thing about NATO. Sorry to say it's funny, but it is in a way. Sweden and Finland are officially neutral, but they are in fact de facto NATO members. And we have Turkey, which in the future is, and also today, is NATO member, but in fact is neutral. And then we have here also, there's no doubt that after Ukraine, Georgia will be the next thing for the Russians to discuss what to do in Georgia, and I think the Russians will I don't think maybe they will even have to invade Georgia. I think the government in Tbilisi will simply see what happened in Ukraine, and they will find another solution than the Ukrainians to live with Russia in future. And this goes, of course, down to Armenia and Azerbaijan too. So with this presentation, I will here finish off and say once again thank you. If you have any questions, I will be happy to take them, and I will leave the word over to you again, Tatiana. Thank you for allowing me for this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Karsten Riise. Thank you so much for sharing your unique perspectives and information which is not widely talked about in the popular media outlets. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the presence of so-called extreme right representatives in the Ukrainian political circles. And you also mentioned their specific agenda, which is related to basically to clean nation and what we can call Ukraine for Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciate, I truly appreciate sharing your kind of alternative viewpoints compared to what we usually watch and hear from the main international media sources. Thank you so much once again, sir. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And I would kindly invite Mr. Ararat Kostanian from Armenia to give his presentation. I think you should, sir, you should unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on this platform again, and my regards to my old colleagues there. Actually, some of the things that I wanted to mention, it's already my colleagues have spoken about, but I will more generalize. Concerning the issue now, I would not only go back to 2014 and 2008, but I would go back to 90s after the Warsaw Pact, when there was a deal between the Russians and the Americans that NATO will not expand to the east. Thus, if there is an agreement between these two superpowers, how you can explain the expansion of NATO to Eastern Europe? And now, as we see, when it's mentioned about the color revolutions, like a domino effect, one after another in South Caucasus and Eastern Europe. And actually, it's a fact these days that even we cannot discuss this issue, why these colorful revolutions took place under the name of democracy and human rights. I'm not against democracy at all, but we have seen after these regimes came to power in some of countries that the situation became even worse. Corruption didn't vanish. The situation of the people didn't recover or develop. So I will look at this situation from the international politics perspective. One side is the dominant unilateral power from the 90s, the United States and its allies, and on the other side, the new coming superpowers that they are trying to shape the world, to bring the world into unilateral, into bipolar world, and to some extent into multipolar world. So thus, the biggest question I ask to myself as well, why these countries such as India, Russia, China, they don't have the right to be a global power? Why should US dominate the world? So the answer comes from here that the United States currently is acting childish, because every time they see any superpower becoming dominant in its influence zone, they are trying to create a problem like this. This time they are pushing Ukraine forward. Yes, the issue of, I don't call it Nazism, but super ultra nationalism, it has entered to Europe through Ukraine. I believe this is a big problem, not only for Ukraine, not only for Russia, but for the whole world. I will bring you one example to this context. A few days ago, some Islamists, they spread a video that if there is a need, they will join Ukraine to fight against Russia because Russia fought against them in Syria. I mean, who can expect a Christian ultra-nationalist groups will join with Islamist radicals to fight against another country, and in these terms, Russia. So, and another issue here also comes the threat on my region, South Caucasus, because we are still currently on the state of war, even though the war has ended in Nagorno-Karabakh, but on our borders in Armenia, there is clashes between Azerbaijani and Armenian troops. So if escalation goes and this war prolongs, we have imminent threat on our borders because Turkey and Azerbaijan, they are talking very clearly that they will pass the southern part of Armenia, the Zangezur corridor, and they want to unite Turkey and Azerbaijan together. This is imminent threat for us in terms of another war and in terms of spreading terrorism again, because during Nagorno-Karabakh war, Turkey deployed terrorists from Syria and Libya to this war. So yes, I understand that the conflict in Ukraine now will have economic and political problems, but I put the stress on how to counter this problem if erupts. I mean, how to fight against another terroristic actions. That is one place. Second, we know that in Europe, nationalism is not something new, and I'm not against nationalism if the nationalism is played well, such as in Russia and China and India. I mean, they have their nationalistic ideologies, but they are not willing to conquer another countries or just erase the culture as Ukrainians doing and were doing from 2014 in Donbass and Lugansk. So if rises the trend of nationalism again in Europe, that will have catastrophic results for Europe itself, because if we consider also the issue that nationalism in all these last years in Europe were rising 30% and above, because some of the ultra-liberal norms or reforms brought sentiments of nationalism to Europe. The good thing here out of this all negative issue that non-alignment power should unite and bring kind of balance here. I see India must play the biggest role here, and some Southeast Asian countries declared that if global war erupts, they will be in non-aligned groups such as Malaysia and the rest. So I believe on this condition that it is very important to bring stability if the war escalates into global and regional and global. And coming back to Turkey's issue, Turkey sided with Ukraine. Turkey's role will be risen up, I think, even if the war stops in the Black Sea area, because we know very well that Turkey has ambitions in Odessa, and they consider Odessa as a battlefield between Ottoman Empire and Russia. So if Turkey starts to rise in South Caucasus and around the Black Sea, that will block the passage of Russia to go and reach to Middle East. I believe that the best option at the moment, Ukraine must play neutral and step back from his rhetoric, because I believe that they don't know on what fire they are playing, because besides what I mentioned, that will be catastrophic results in Europe in terms of rising nationalism, in terms of economic problems, as mentioned before, with rising up the oil prices. But at the same time, the Middle East again will be in another battlefield, just as if we can see Syria now, the war has ended, although we have a lot of problems there. We have been able to clean up the terroristic ISIS groups and etc. But currently they are located in the city Idlib and on the border with Turkey, with support from Turkey. And if Russia steps back and Turkey comes in more, because Turkey is a NATO country and they have the biggest number of troops on the ground, second biggest troops on the ground. So I believe in Middle East also the tensions will rise up. And we know during the war how was quick arming the terrorists, and they seem endless in the numbers. Maybe they are now hidden, but arming them and bringing them up will be not very difficult for Turkey and for its allies. In terms of the relations with China and Russia and the US, I believe, again, this is the US mistake that they urged to both sides to put sanctions on both sides. And it's very logical that two superpowers and another power just, spreading sanctions on every issue. And it's very logical that these two superpowers will ally together. Actually, they are not ally officially, but ideologically, they will ally together against how to overcome these sanctions. And again, what about the sanctions? I don't believe that it will hurt Russia, because if I bring the example that for many decades the sanctions didn't hurt Iran, so how come the sanctions will hurt a superpower like Russia? And at the same time, I would like to bring the notion that the US currently it's not in its position as it used to be during the 90s and afterwards. We have mentioned several times about US media, but I would like to remind you that the other side's media is not weak. The CGTN, the Russia Today, and even if I look to the Arabic channels today, the top two channels as Al Arabiya is more leaning towards Russia. That is based in Saudi Arabia. And of course, Al Jazeera is a Qatari news platform. Of course, it's their ally is Turkey, so they are leaning more to the Ukrainian side. In this media and social media platforms, I don't think that the US is a winner. And also on the ideological side, I believe they are not the winner or the master of the world anymore, because everybody is seeing that when they talk about democracy, it ended up with a war in some part of the world. And if we consider Biden's webinar on online conference with the democratic world, he mentioned that democracy needs reforms. I mean, if he sees that in US they need reform, so how come they will be able to mingle all those powers who believe that the US has the best system in the world and they are the most civilized nation in the world? And considering they are having the racist issue as well, when the incidents happen during the live matters and issues, such issues. Plus, the coronavirus pandemic showed that the US and the West are not able even to control such pandemic in their countries. And I would like to remind that Russia and China, they came to Europe with their medical helps first. So when we put these two superpowers now on balance, I'm not seeing that the US is the winner. But of course, we don't know the outcome, what will be, if this will go for global war or if anybody will use a nuclear weapon. But at the moment, I have mentioned on the media platform and on ideological platform that they are not the sole winner, and in some way this is a positive remark that in the world to be different powers so the stability can be assured.
Oh. Mr. Kostanian, have you finished? Right?
No, 1 second.
Because we couldn't hear you for the moment.
Now you can hear me?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Loud and clear.
The multi-power non-aligned powers that I have mentioned, that could be very interesting issue if we take into example that if India can be the leading power of non-alignment, not only with some Asian countries such as I have mentioned before, such as former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, has announced that they will be in non-aligned group. They have good relations with China and they have good relations with US. And I believe that in Europe itself, some powers also should be in non-aligned. For example, Greece, Bulgaria, that they have historical and good relations. Cyprus, for example, that they have good relations with Russia as well, although being in European Union. Considering Russia, when we have mentioned that what will be in Georgia in future, I believe at the moment Russia is, if he becomes the winner out of this war, I believe Russia will constitute a union such as the European Union, and it will integrate all the post-Soviet countries such as Armenia, Georgia, and other Kazakhstan and other countries. I don't think that Armenia will reject to this proposal because, as I have mentioned, we are in imminent war threat every second, that we are expecting that Turkey must attack southern Armenia and unite Azerbaijan. And that is big threat not only for us, that is big threat for Russia itself, because we know that Turkey is trying to establish a pan-Turanic empire to reach until the borders on China and unite Xinjiang, where they have Turkic Uyghur people. So that will ignite also the ambitions of the Muslim people in southern Russia. And as I have mentioned before, that will create again big problem in terms of Islamic extremism and jihadism. In terms of Arabic countries, if we take, for example, very interesting, it's the key players in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, I believe, although is a US ally, but we have seen last years they are becoming closer to Russia, and even they have announced their willingness to buy S-400 systems. So I believe Saudi Arabia will not side with the USA and other countries, of course, not only allies to Russia, such as Syria or the rest. Lebanon will be non-allied. Jordan will be non-allied. I mean, Iraq probably has its own problems, and I don't think they will be allied with US either. So the key point is here that as I have mentioned, Biden's conference, that it was an attempt to recollect the democratic world and recollect allies around USA. But I believe it will not work. They will not be able to bring together allies, although they are in NATO, although they are in European Union, but some countries as I have mentioned, will not be in war against Russia. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ararat. Thank you so much for making your really insightful presentation. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that, rightly mentioned, that we cannot view a particular conflict in isolation, but rather within the larger geopolitical and or regional context. The large part of your presentation was focused on the role of the medium power countries that could be part of a non-aligned and balanced group. Thank you so much once again, and let me invite Mr. Abhinav Pandya for sharing his thoughts. Mr. Abhinav?
Yes, yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Tatiana, for inviting me, and I'm absolutely delighted to hear so many expert opinions from a very informed and esteemed panel of speakers. So I'm going to talk more about the Indian reaction to this whole Ukraine-Russia war. Okay. So India has officially abstained from the UNSC vote, and in most of the media reportings, Indian stand has been typically termed as a neutral stance. And if I were to use if I'm to use a typical IR jargon, it can be described as a tightrope balancing between the US and Russia, or the Western world and Russia. So first and foremost, I would like to say that this is not something which is specific to India only. This kind of balancing is being done by various other countries also. Israel is doing this kind of balancing. Egypt is doing. Many other countries in the Middle Eastern world, like Saudi Arabia, they are also doing it. And in particular, especially after the year 2015, when Russians became a very powerful and a potent force in the Middle Eastern world, this kind of balancing has become very crucial to the Middle Eastern countries also. So now coming back to India, so whenever we analyze India's understanding of international relations or its outcomes in terms of its reactions or behaviors, I guess we should need to we need to look at the strategic subconscious mind of India in general, which is again guided by the theory of knowledge, which certainly prevails in the Oriental philosophy, basically the Indian philosophy, and that relies on the idea of the manyness of reality. In one of the Indian schools of philosophy, we use the term Syadvar, which says that reality is many-sided, it's plural, it's multiple. So therefore, the idea of one size fits all is not something which is very convincing to the Indians. So if the Western world or any analyst from the liberal segment, they would say that this is a clear case of aggression and the violation of territorial sovereignty or the breach of territorial sovereignty, Indian strategic mind will not be convinced, because Indian strategic mind would like to see the entire event in its wider perspectives, like, for instance, the expansion of the NATO in this Russian region. And after having the treaties in 1997 that the Western world would not be expanding to the eastern side, but even then it has happened. So that becomes a very strong factor of consideration in this Indian strategic calculus. And then if once again, many commentators would like to say that it's a clear case of aggression or violation. Okay, then again, once again, the Indian strategic mind would like to counter these things by giving certain other examples, like what happened in the case of Iraq, what happened in the case of Libya, where the invasion happened under the pretext of some false accusations. Weapons of mass destruction were not found, and ultimately it led to the creation of to the emergence of a very brutal and a deadly terrorist organization like ISIS. Okay, we are not saying that whether any particular country was responsible for that or not, but the whole disruption and the mess which happened, which emerged after the US and the Western invasions in these particular countries, that led to the creation of deadly terrorist organizations like ISIS, and we are still dealing with them right now. Second aspect of India's India's overall behavior in the international relations is guided by some realistic factors, and there comes the national interest. So I must say that right in the beginning, after the year 1947, when India got its independence, for many decades, Indian foreign policy had very strong moralistic overtones, which again comes from India's religious, spiritual, subconscious mind. Of renunciation and all, and those moralistic overtones made India to act in a very non-aligned manner, certainly with a tilt towards Russia because of some realistic considerations. Okay? But then that policy became more and more realistic over a period of time. Then it acquired the form of strategic autonomy, which has less of a moral baggage and more of a realism, in which India wanted to be charting its own course. And today, I feel that especially over the last few years, this strategic autonomy has, in many ways, it has turned into some kind of strategic vulnerability also, because of various reasons. Because the China has been showing a very aggressive and a very expansionist behavior on our northern frontier, and on the west, Pakistan has continuously abetted terrorism, and because of India's internal problems where jihadism continues to grow, government faces a constant domestic backlash, from various quarters, definitely aided by certain international forces. So India is actually caught in a situation where it's really difficult to take a stand. Now coming to some more concrete and factual parts. Just a moment. I guess it's asking me to switch off my camera. Sorry. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So with Russia, India has a historic friendship, and historic friendship. It's based on deep-rooted, I would say, the cultural linkages, and also a very natural, some kind of affinity at a psychological, emotional level. Apart from that, a certain very strong economic and materialistic considerations are there. Like India is heavily dependent on Russia for its defense purchase. Even in between 2015 to 2019, more than half of India's defense equipment came from Russia. Oh, that's a very, very important consideration in India's line of thinking. And besides that, India is a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which Russia continues to be an important player. And India is also a member of BRICS, in which Russia is there. In the past, Russia has helped India on various occasions, especially in the 1971 war, and various other international platforms. Russia has sided with India. Russia has voted in the favor of India. However, over the last 20 years, in particular after the disintegration of Soviet Union, India started expanding its relationship with the other countries, especially with the Western world. And over the last 20 years, India has developed a very critical and an important partnership with the Americans, which is again based on the exchange of defense technology and the signing of the civilian nuclear deal and all. But once again, I must say that even the 20 years of hard work has not generated a flawless bonhomie and a very smooth love or some kind of a partnership between India and the US. There is a very subtle, hidden sense of uneasiness and distrust that prevails between India and the US, and which has become more evident in the recent past, especially after the Chinese invasion in the Galwan area. India did not get the expected support from the US, and even in the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan, India did not get the expected support from the US, and especially Pakistan has been a very prominent adversary of India as far as abetting terrorism is concerned. And United States stance has been very ambivalent regarding the Pakistan, and many commentators in India currently say that, it's not something which in particular I say, but many commentators certainly would say that even half of the sanctions which America is imposing on Russia, if they had been imposed on Pakistan, things would have been very different as far as terrorism is concerned in South Asia. So that sense of uneasiness certainly prevails. And then India also, in part, agrees with what Russia is doing in, Russian concerns, because it's quite similar to what China is doing in South Asia. China is expanding its sphere of influence in South Asia, which has traditionally been in India's area or India's influence area. So China's growing ties with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh, with Pakistan, that disturbs India. So it pretty much rhymes with Russian concerns in the Eastern Europe and in Ukraine. So that's certainly a big factor. And so now what is going to be the likely impact for India in the future? I feel that, I mean, this whole scenario, I mean, no, I'm trying to be very realistic. This whole scenario is going to benefit India, more or less, okay, or in an overall terms, because after the sanctions, Russia would be heavily dependent on China, and the Russian position also becomes a little vulnerable. So with this, I feel that, I mean, Russians will be needing India more, because they will certainly want to have an option, an alternative in the form of India. And this is important because over the last few years, even India-Russian relationship had become a little sour because of India's growing ties with the US and also because of Russia's growing ties with China and Pakistan. But now it seems that these ties will be on a more even platform. And if Russia becomes a little more entangled in the Ukrainian situation, then also Russia will need India more as a friend. And certainly India is willing to reciprocate that. On the other side, even West will need India because certainly West has been completely exposed. The NATO's stands totally exposed, in particular after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and after the Russian invasion on Ukraine. The trust has diminished. No one would like to trust NATO for its security. And the Western world would need India because India has very strong ties with Russia. So they'll need India as a negotiator, as kind of a peacemaker between India and the West, between the Russia and the West. And coming to China, I feel that even if Russia gets a little entangled in Ukraine because of the civilian resistance, this will kind of demotivate China from pursuing expansionist ambitions in Taiwan and in the Tibetan region. Okay, so that benefits India. And the other situation, like if Russia emerges entirely successful, like totally successful and very powerful in that region, that also benefits India because after that it's only Taiwan which is left, And if China plans to invade Taiwan, and in that case, if the Western world doesn't react or doesn't counter, then Western world stands completely collapsed and it has no claim to any leadership role in the global security architecture. So Western world will be compelled to counter China's expansionist ambitions in Taiwan. So that position also in a way is beneficial to India. Apart from that, Turkey in this entire situation stands a little weakened. Its ties with NATO and the Western Europe were already already getting in a bad shape because of its ties with Islamist terrorist groups like ISIS and all. And after this war, Turkey-Russia ties are going to deteriorate a bit because Turkey has supported Ukraine, and Turkey's economy is also floundering. So that benefits India because over the last few years, Turkey has emerged as a very strong proponent of jihadi terrorist groups in Kashmir and a very strong ally of Pakistan in countering India in various international platforms. So this situation benefits in a way. Finally, I would say that this whole scenario ultimately leads to a multipolar world. So this idea of multipolar world is something in agreement with India's philosophical thought on the strategic issues. India would never be willing to propagate or project a world security architecture which is led by hegemons. So this multipolar world certainly suits us more than anything else, but no doubt it's going to be a little bit more chaotic, anarchic, and more uncertain. But India's position becomes a little more stronger, and the pressure which India was facing from the Western world, like Western world was pressurizing India not to buy S-400 or face CATSA sanctions. Even from the Russians and Chinese, India was facing this kind of a pressure that, don't be seen too much with the Western world. So this pressure would certainly ease. And I see that, India is on a much, India is in a position to have more independent decisions, and to follow an independent line of thinking and relationship with China also, with Russia also, and with the Western world. And conversely, the other countries have also displayed a very strong understanding about this. Like recently, the Americans said that, India's relationship with the US is totally independent of its relationship with the US. So that means they understand our concerns and our relationship with Russia. And I guess they also understand that this position can be used to benefit or to bring world peace rather than, pressurize India or to just to degrade or erode its ties with Russia. And India is also has become a little more balanced in its approach, because previously India was tilting very strongly towards the Americans, but now after the Galwan recent China clash and the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, India has realized that it's better to follow a more realistic policy. Therefore, India is trying to be, trying to work out an arrangement with China, and also trying to crack down on the terrorist infrastructure in Kashmir, and making sure that it doesn't, its association with Americans doesn't offend China or Russia. So that's my case, thank you so much. Hello? Hello?
Oh, I really apologize. I muted
Okay,
myself
no.
and then I forgot to unmute.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pandya, for sharing your thoughts. And you mentioned in the beginning that India's response can be viewed through the prism of ancient Indian philosophy, even that there can be various interpretation of the reality, that there are many nuances, we can say. What India is showing us is that we should not be very categorical in our assessment of any geopolitical scenario.
Yes.
And India's cautious approach can be understood also through the specific relations between India and Russia. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And we are entering the stage of a Q&A phase, and I see the hand, and there was a question in the chat box. So yeah, please, Major Samar, you can raise your question.
Okay, my question is that firstly, with the current situation that is unfolding at Kiev, in the coming 1 month, I wanted to ask you, in case if there is a decisive action by Russia, so what would be the most likely thing for them to do? Are they going to? They are definitely moving in their S-500, what they did in Syria. So they are going to impose a direct contact and confrontation with the NATO countries at the borders. So do you feel it is going to spread? Because Poland itself has given a statement stating that they will be allowing the Ukrainian Air Force pilots to use their airfields for attacks against the Russians. So is it going to even spread more deeper into Europe? What is your take on that?
Thank you, Major Tour. Who would be willing to answer this question? Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Karsten.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Major Samar, for your question, because I think this is something which is on the mind of all of us. What is happening next? What is the end game of this, or is there any end game? And that is actually my view. There is no in this way end game for this. It will go on in different ways that will change the world totally and forever, not only in Europe but in the whole world. And also in China and Asia. I do not believe, to take that first, I do not believe that China will be discouraged from taking Taiwan. On the contrary, there is nothing which will prevent China from taking Taiwan. And that will change the world totally, because just like Russia controls more than 50% of the gas going to Germany, Taiwan is producing more than 50% of all the high-end chips for the whole world. I mean, that alone is reason enough for China to take Taiwan. There is one big company, I think it's called TSMC, if I'm saying this right, and that company is the simple biggest company in all chip production. And if China controls that on Taiwan, then the USA will be tech embargoed, not China. So China will be top on, not only as the biggest trading nation. People forget that, say that USA is still number one. Yes, that is only in GDP only, but in trading, everybody in the whole world nearly, except Mexico and Canada, are trading more with China than with the USA. Everybody, all Asian trades more with China than with the USA. Even Korea.
I'd like to add one more point.
I can't hear you. You have been muted.
No,
Yeah,
yes, please.
what I wanted to say, China has indirectly been using its cheap labor policies for getting the countries trapped into debt. So this has become more of a weapon that China took as an approach to occupy or to make the country so dependent on them. For example, the best example we can give is of Sri Lanka. They've already taken over the port. They are issuing passports to those workers who are going to be permanently deployed in Sri Lanka at the port for working. So there's a place called Djibouti. It's a permanent military base for China now. So in the Gulf of Aden, China is going to make its presence very sure. I was deployed in South Sudan. The most important oil fields in South Sudan were manned by the Chinese army. The vital oil installations in South Sudan. So basically, China has already spread its required tentacles, and with time, it will not be very far away that Taiwan will be overthrown and taken over by China as well. Now, the main question is, why would another country come and defend Taiwan? Because are we dependent on Taiwan by any manner whatsoever? Is Taiwan that important, or it has that impact in the world that any country, for example, the Quad, Australian or Japanese, would dare to go in for a war, which will be for a long haul? You cannot afford to go to China and say it's going to be a 10-day or a 15 days war, because China can afford a war for long. As far as US is concerned, it has already drained out its dollars in Afghanistan. $3 trillion have been spent for the war in Afghanistan. So strategically, China is at the upper hand. Then another psychological aspect is, we must not forget Russia and China share borders. They also have
I'm so sorry I'm cutting you off, but we are really running out of time. If you can just conclude your remarks, please.
What I'm basically trying to get at is, wherever Russia is going to move, China is going to be in its shadow. And as far as India is concerned, for its survival and quick development, as we are pacing up with our GDP, it will be Russia which will be providing us more demands for trade, because they are going to be cut off and we are a non-allied country. So indirectly, yes, China, Russia and India in the coming time are going to play a very vital and a crucial role. However, India will not agree to align with any of the countries, because we do not have the mindset of any occupation of any land, or have a mindset or a perception of an aggressor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Major Samartur. I think Mr. Ararat Kostanian would like to answer this question as well.
As I have mentioned in my presentation, that the conflict or the crisis is not only situated in one place. It's not European conflict, it's global conflict. And the conditions will spread. I didn't mention in my presentation not to go too broad. If we remember a few months ago what happened in Kazakhstan, that Russia deployed CSTO troops. I mean, that was an attempt of another color revolution, joining Turkey behind by this pan-Turkic ideology, because Kazakhstan is one of the most important places for Turkey to spread their ideology and to be the leader of the Turkic countries. But at the same time, as it's mentioned that France and Germany, they are bringing their arms into readiness, I would like to mention that in Syria as well, Russia is bringing very heavy weapons to their Russian base. So I believe that there is the danger that this hybrid war will be continuous, and if today can little bit be controllable after Russia sees victory on the Ukrainian ground, I'm not surprised that again tensions could start in Middle East and precisely and especially in Syria, because last few months we are seeing continuous escalation between Israel and Syria. They are hitting each other on the border and near to Golan Highlands. So I believe hybrid wars will continue even if there is no very quick global war or use of nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much, Mr.
And sorry, and of course, South Caucasus as well, as I have mentioned in my presentation. Here is also a very, how to say, very energetic place for creating another war for Turkey and ambitious Azerbaijan. So I believe that Middle East, South Caucasus, and Europe now under this continuous hybrid war scenarios.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Mr. Ararat. And I think Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu would like to make his comments as well, right?
Thank you very much. I just want to touch on 2 points. One is the issue of debt that Major Tor brought up, because with firm I work for, we specifically work on Chinese lending in African countries, and from our own research at Development Reimagined, I can tell you specifically there are only 5 African countries that are actually at risk of debt default. So most of the hysteria that you hear or most of the coverage you hear in the media is mostly sensationalism. Let me give you an example. In 2020, there was a massive movement and media coverage from CNN, from BBC, and all of the major news that Nigeria has a China debt problem. In fact, there was even call for an investigation going back 20 years to look at all of the lending that's come from China into Nigeria. And our government kept saying it's not what it seems, it's not what it seems. And even we knew, because we have been looking at the numbers in our consultancy. And then the Nigerian Debt Management Office, which is the official state agency for managing the country's public debt, put out our full debt profile, which we haven't done for in a while. And when you look at the figures, only 4% of Nigeria's debt is owed to China. 4%. You want to know what the percentage of the World Bank is? You want to know what percentage of the IMF is, and what to the other Eurobond lenders is? Massive. They own majority of our debt stock. The same situation is what you find in many African countries. Now, we're not saying the issue of debt is not a concern, but the more pressing concern is the lack of infrastructure. As I'm talking to you now, when I started this conversation, I had power, but for the last 1 hour, the light has gone off. I can almost guarantee that every one of you here still have electricity supply in your homes. Why don't? This is the capital of a country that is the biggest economy on the continent, with over 200 million people, and we still have struggle with financing to build infrastructure to power the economy. So when you hear the Europeans talk about China taking over Africa through debt, and what we always say is no, they are the most likely to give us this financing, because there's severe need for this financing. By middle of this century, Africa will be 2.4 billion people. What that means is that we have to build double all our infrastructure, particularly critical infrastructure that are already in deficit already. So energy access has to be double to meet, because we're already 1.2 billion now, will be double in about 30 years. So the concern is understood, but you have to know that the realities on the ground here is massive, and that's why when the global gateway is coming and all of the B3W is coming up, we're not seeing sincerity. It's just all talk. Then my last point would be on Chinese and the coordination with the mentioned Sudan. You mentioned Djibouti, where the Chinese base in Djibouti is one of about 7 foreign military bases in Djibouti. Djibouti is essentially a military hotel. You know, the Italians are there, the Japanese are there, the Americans are there, the French are there. You know, nobody talks about that with any form of fear. We're only trained to fear, you know, Russia. You know, when the Russia, with this report about Russia wants to go into Sudan, you need to see the coverage as well. We're trained to fear, cooperation with non-Western countries, and I think that's something that we need to really understand. There's a French company that controls 16 ports in Africa, 16, and this is something that it is not accepted. It won't be accepted anywhere else in the world, but we are told to accept it because it's a French company, you know. So just as a gesture, I would say when we're looking at even the continent today, there's real genuine push to actually be in the game of changing things, and we know that we cannot change our situation here on the continent without looking at countries who genuinely have a different outlook of the world, and the countries who have shown that they want to really make things different than it is now, because in the current order, Africa is at the bottom of the pecking order. It might be okay for everybody else, but it's not okay for us. That's what happened in Mali. That's what is happening in Burkina Faso. These are the countries that have been able to take the initiative to say, we want to change a system by starting to changing the regimes in our own countries. And then from there, we could form alignment with countries who we believe we can share and craft a new, global order. So when we're looking at the big picture, when we're looking at Africa today, some countries might not look like they're thinking big, but I can guarantee you many countries are thinking very big. Ethiopia, for instance, they are not comfortable with those military bases in Djibouti. They are not. But they will not express it. But when the war in Ethiopia, when the war in Tigray region broke out, and you see how the Ethiopians were playing it, they were very concerned that if the Tigray issue is going to explode, all of those weapons and all of the support that the West and those guys in the State Department will be pushing will be coming through those bases, into Djibouti, and then supplying Tigray. So, and they were thinking, so where are we going to get ours from? Because they are landlocked. There is the Russian base for instance, in Sudan would have been an option. Even the Chinese. So all of these are not. They're not very simplistic, or it's very simple if you look at it from the outside, but within the continent, we know what's happening. We know who is doing what, but it bears mentioning to know that we look at things very differently from what is covered, in the popular media. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Eguegu. I would like to ask Mr. Arun Anand, right? But please make it short because we are running out of time. Yeah, so my humble request to make it really short. My apology for that. Mr. Anand?
I just want to ask one thing. Can some of the panelists throw more light on the disinformation campaigns and the propaganda wars which are going on right now between both sides? The Western Bloc, which is basically running a propaganda war, probably on behest of Ukraine, and then on the Russian side also. So could somebody elaborate on that?
Thank you, Mr. Anand. Yeah, Mr. Karsten, what is your take on that?
My take on that is that the West has a false impression of their own goodness. The West is shutting down Russian media because they say they spread disinformation, and at the same time they do the same themselves. Russia has made one disinformation, and that is they have been trying to sort of building up a case that there would be a Ukrainian aggression, which is obviously not a right presentation of the situation. And the Russians have been doing that, and I have been feeling sorry that Russia has done that, because Russia has actually a very good case to build on, and no need to come with this kind of disinformation. But the other information from Russia seems to be rather okay. There is a steady stream of information from the US side, and this is all the big US media, CNN, Politico, New York Times, MSNBC, all of them, that sort of portraying that Russia has problems, that Russia cannot do this, and so on. And a lot of the information or disinformation coming from these sources, CNN and New York Times, is pure distraction, pure disinformation. First, before the war started, there was an information in quotation mark from CNN that Russia could not work militarily because the snow was melting and they had the Rasputitsa. You know that, Tatiana?
Yes.
That was no problem for Russia. It was just invented by the CNN, and the CNN have an very old, bad connection to CIA. They are informed by the CIA. It goes all the back to 1960 when the CIA murdered Lumumba back in Africa. They wanted to post Lumumba as Man of the Year, and the CIA just called the managing editor of CNN, or it was Time Media at that time, Time Magazine, and said, don't post that. It was just a phone call from CIA, and they did not post and make Lumumba a Man of the Year, because the CIA had already decided to kill Lumumba, and they didn't want him to be a hero and be Man of the Year. And you have this kind of information this morning from New York Times. I see a repeated story from USA, how Ukrainians are making a big resistance against Russian forces. And when you see what they come up with for stories from the CNN, there is no big resistance in Ukraine. It is a very feeble resistance. The Ukrainians cannot and will not, as a big population, put up with a big guerrilla fight or anything like that for the coming years. So that's my take on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Riise. Thank you. Thank you once again. And finally, your thoughts, Mr. Peter Force.
Hi.
Yeah.
I want to answer that about propaganda. There is a very old saying about it. The first casualty of war is the truth. So you need really to pick and choose here and be very critical to everything you read, see, and hear. So what is happening in Ukraine, I don't really know. Nobody really knows. So I usually, especially when it comes to the numbers of casualties, you shall be extremely careful there, because both sides are suffering casualties. And how many? Just ignore it. Just ignore it. And I think I heard a question earlier about if this can spread into NATO countries. Probably not, unless it happens by an accident. If, let's say, a Russian missile by accident hit something in Poland, then we have a storm. And I'm in Sweden, as you probably know. This war has caused. I'm one of the few people, perhaps here, that wasn't surprised with this war, because I've studied almost every darn wars since the First World War. So, and the military, but I'm not so good with the economics side of this kind of war. But the military, they are trained exactly the same all over the world. They make them very predictable, extremely predictable. There is one country that is not so predictable, and that is Israel. I realized pretty fast this is going to go to a war, because when you begin to deploy forces and mobilizing them, there is no way back. It's only forward. So I was not surprised. How this war is going, I have seen little strange things about the Russian forces. This convoy or column of vehicles from the north, they are driving bumper to bumper. That is extremely unwise to do in a war zone, because that is a great target if the Ukrainians can hit them. And how they are fighting this war, I think there is one other war back in 1939-40, the Finnish Winter War. It reminds a little bit of this one, actually. But that is my major point. I don't think this will spread to what can happen here is Sweden and Finland are neutral countries. We have been intertwined with the West for a very long time. This can actually push us into NATO. So my reaction to all this is what President Putin has achieved is actually what he doesn't want to happen. He has united NATO and European Union in a way I've never seen before. The NATO countries and European countries, we are few outside NATO, we are increasing our defense budget rapidly now. We are not scared of the Russians, but we are angry, really angry. I am not personally angry. I don't mind the Russians. And this, I don't know how it's going to end. I noticed something when the Ukrainians were handing out assault rifles to the civilians. It might be a contrary. I disagree with respect to, I don't know all the names. It might be a symmetric war after this. And when I use the term symmetric wars, I mean guerrilla war. That is a military term. We call wars, we divide them symmetric, asymmetric wars. And then we have other terms for wars as well. And I've studied these kind of wars, so I'm not surprised what happened. And that is really weird for the Swedish take of this, is we are providing them with weapons now. And we haven't done that since 1939, when we gave a lot to Finns. We gave it so much to the Finns that we could barely defend ourselves when the Germans invaded Norway and Denmark. We don't want to repeat that, perhaps. That is my thing. Thank you for having me here, first of all. Second, thank you very much. It's very nice to meet you all.
Thank you. The same here. I think we should stop here.
Yes.
Yeah, we have had a fascinating,
and I have one thing. Sorry, I cannot participate in the second part of this session later today. Sorry, it would be nice, but I have other things. I need to work, actually. I have been writing a paper about the Ukrainians. And I have Usama Foundation. And I'm sorry to say this. I was asked to write a paper about right-wing terrorism in Europe. I've started it, but I don't work. And it landed that a little bit. So it will be delayed. It will be coming, a paper about it. And I have a question here, because in Europe we have a, I can take that personally with him. Sorry.
All right, Mr. Thank you.
My question is not answered, sir. It's in the chat box. Can somebody help me, please?
Mr. Hubert, we understand, but we are really running on short,
Okay,
and
okay.
the other panelists, we are already over
Okay.
half an hour. Thank you so much. I would like to close this session now. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you our panelists for sharing those useful insights on the matter. Thank you, Mr. Eguegu, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Banik. Thank you, Mr. Kostanian and Mr. Pandya as well. And I especially want to thank Mr. Riise because he also helped us organize this event. And at the end, I would like to thank Dr. Belsuwa for generously and very objectively moderating this session. Everyone like you in that role, we are receiving the feedback constantly. So I would like to thank everyone again. And we have second session scheduled at 6 p.m. Indian time. So I would request everyone to join and to understand this situation from a clearer perspective. And I would like to close the session now. And as Mr. Hubert said something, and I would like to close on the same note that